So, thank you, Jeff, for inviting me to speak. This was not one of the submitted peer review papers. This was an invitation. And so this is an essay. This is a lot of thoughts about the landscape. This is not a case study per se. And I'm going to talk about the issue that I wanted to talk about was diversity. And so as I thought about the diversity of the JATS landscape, that comes from many different things, the community, the standards, and a lot has to do with change over time. And so what this is going to be is an essay on diversity and the community and content management strategies for coping with diversity and change. So, as I thought about diversity, we think about, simultaneous. We do this, they do that, we're using the same standard, we do it differently. But the more I thought about it, things change over time. We may do it differently now than we do it in the future, or the standard may change, and so on. So we can't talk about managing diversity without also managing change as well. So that's where this essay moved as I was working on it. So, start with the community itself. This is from the NISO webpage. It's a statement about the JATS standard process, that it's, user-driven. User-suggested changes now are collected and discussed by the JATS Standing Committee, who decide on action based on NISO continuous maintenance procedures. I am on the NISO Board of Directors, and so NISO has a variety of different standards and more than one approach. And this one, the continuous maintenance procedure, is very interesting and very important to JATS because our world keeps changing year after year. So we can't wait 5 years or 10 years for an annual or a periodic review. There has to be a continuous process. And NISO has made this possible going forward. So when we think about what the community, the JATS community is, it's just a lot of amazing things. And as I was preparing this, I went back and basically read all the papers from year one of JATSCon to today. And it is an awesome collection of really great work that people have contributed to JATSCon. If you weren't here for all of them, I would say go back and look at the proceedings from the years you didn't hear. There are some awesome and useful, valuable things there. It's a fantastic set of proceedings. And thanks to Jeff and his colleagues for making this possible. It was an important part of the JATS landscape is JATSCon. Another piece is the JATS list, which Mulberry hosts for us, the listserv. Over the years, the listserv has been rather quiet. I would say, for my judgment, I would say feel free to, if you have a question, share it with the community. The list is there, and we're happy to answer collectively and discuss. So feel free to use the list whenever you want to. And it's not embarrassing to have a question. We don't hold it against people. Ask what the best practice is for this or that, or is there a way to do this? Feel free to use the list. The other piece of the community, of course, is the NISO framework for JATS, the Standing Committee, which I am on. And I have to say that being on the JATS committee has been a fantastic experience, that it is truly collaborative. It's a great group of people, publishers, archives, service providers, consultants, lots of cross-community experience. But the great thing is that as a group, it is truly collaborative. Not one person has all the ideas and that's the end of the discussion. People contribute and we collectively come up with the best possible solutions. So it has been a very positive experience, and I think one of the strengths of JATS. And then finally, the last and most important piece of the community is your public comments, and that's the maintenance procedure going forward. So we have the session tomorrow where you can talk about things. There's the formal comment submission form via NISO, and of course questions on the listserv. But, speak up. That's how the standard adds value, is to the community. But that's also where the diversity comes from, because the community is very wide. So we'll come back to that. So, structural diversity, the standard itself, as Jeff just mentioned, it has several colors, the different tags sets, And it is an extremely rich vocabulary, and as you dive into it, there are lots of things where there are multiple ways of doing something. And that is actually a good thing because it reflects the community. So just a simple one, affiliations. In article affiliations, some publishers, they're all footnotes linked down from the names. In others, it's ABC, Harvard, DEF, Yale, that kind of grouping and so on. And JATS supports all of these alternatives, which means there's lots of different ways to do things, including and that's a reflection of the complexity of the content landscape. And that leads to another important piece of JATS, which is the common tagging practice section of the JATS documentation, which if you don't know that, you should definitely read that. It's an important piece. But the complexity of JATS comes from the community, and the community is not just, who's making XML with JATS. It's that what are the business needs of the community. So as Bruce Rosenblum gave a talk last year at JATSCon about the external content standards and how they get incorporated into JATS. And if you want to know more about that, read his excellent paper on that topic. But at various different levels, JATS includes other markup standards like MathML, which are referenced by namespace, things that are cloned into the vocabulary, like sorry, there's a typo there, not XTHML, tables, and things that we now support, such as the content models to add, so you can add RDFA, and so on. But on the business level, JATS also has to support the things that the publishing industry is doing with metadata, and you hear about those. And so all of those community connections are a strength of JATS, but that means there will be change. Change is inevitable. There'll be a new standard about some business thing that will then have to be incorporated in JATS, which means diversity is simultaneous and over time, because the JATS supports the community. So, but the fun one is to think about the usage of JATS, and if you go back through the last 4 years of JATSCon, there's lots of fantastic papers on this. I didn't put the full citations up, but you can find them on the website easily. The flexibility of the vocabulary itself. Do you do subsets? Do you do supersets? Best practices, all the different ways to do references, case studies of publishers, and aggregator case studies. Portico, for example, where I worked, and we processed content from 70 publishers and dealt with about 200 flavors of markup across 70 publishers. So there is a lot of information about the diversity in JATSCon over the years, and usage is certainly a big piece of that. So as you start to think about a mental framework for understanding or thinking about the landscape of usage and so on, I first said, could we do a pyramid? Well, what do you do in a title? Well, what do you do in a set of titles? What does a publisher do? What does the industry do? That would be a pyramid. But our landscape is more complicated than that. It's not as simple as a single pyramid. And it isn't even a simple Venn diagram either. There are practices that are common across types of articles, across disciplines, across journals, across publishers. It is a complicated landscape with a variety of usage. And so on. So no simple diagram and the bottom line is all of that complexity then still changes over time. So let's look at some of the changes. Obviously markup related, the standard itself evolves, and any standard when it evolves, is it backward compatible or not? How are the new features added? Are old features deprecated? And as the standards evolve, the usage can evolve and the best practices as well. And so then there's that large issue. Would you need to apply these changes retroactively to your corpus of content? Do you need consistency across your entire content collection? And so that is a big strategic question that everyone has to think about, although it's not always applicable, and potentially a big task. And in 20+ plus years of HTML and XML markup, I've seen lots of instances of retroactive cleanup. So another set of change is, if you're thinking about content management strategies for change, it's not just the markup, it's also the content itself and lots of aspects of that. The text can be versioned, and if you have generated text or generated formatting rules, are you archiving those rules as well so that you know what your presentation is in the future? So that whole issue of, is content formatting internal and explicit, or is it external and potentially lost, can be a problem. And one funny example, when we migrated platforms at AIP Publishing and we had 80 years of journal content, one of our society publishers wanted all the text formatted as the same way it was in the print, even though that had changed over the years. And that level of granularity wasn't in the markup. Another piece is editorial styling. That is not, by that I mean things like, what are the section headings of a journal, how are the affiliations done, things like that. The editorial style can change over time, and then that can be a problem too. Again, in the platform migration at AIP Publishing, we had the sections of a journal changed over the years. And so how did you build the navigation to reflect the current structure of the journal or the 30-year-old structure, or both? Things like that. So change is an issue. Another example is metadata vocabularies. Those can change over time. Again, at AIP Publishing, they had a vocabulary called PACS, and what they did is they embedded the version number of the vocabulary in the XML with the keywords. So the keywords were there, but it also said PACS 2010 or PACS 2009, which version of PACS those keywords were. So they had built into their XML a version control for that. But as we use external metadata vocabularies, they can change. Big one right now in publishing is the FundRef vocabulary, which is changing every month. And things can add or be taken away from that. And so it is worth thinking about, how do you track which version your data is of that external taxonomy. So that's a classic kind of content management things. So if you look at this, diversity and change management, standards change, standard usage changes, content usage can change. So how do you manage all of that? What are the strategies for that? And it's more than just the routine content management versioning. Most content management systems, you can just have numbered versions with a little description of what the version is and who did it. But there's a lot more on the table here than just that. And so as I thought about this, what of course rang bells with me is what happens in the digital preservation space, which I worked in my days in Portico. And I was involved in a project called PREMIS, Preservation Metadata Implementation Strategy, and version 1 of that. They're on to version 3 now. And in the digital space, because it is all about the long-term management of content, they have gone to an extreme in terms of version control and so on. So they have a repertory of practices that are potentially useful in dealing with change, but they are extreme in some ways. So in digital preservation metadata, they track things like what format a file is, what tool was used to generate it, or convert it or validate it, what software or operating system environment it was done. They create event metadata to say this thing was done on this date by this tool and so forth, and that version. And they have a very robust mindset for keeping track of change and providing technical metadata about the content. So from the premise specification, their example is a format name should be specific, and so names could have subcomponents about what version and date it is. So Here's a little snippet of some lines of metadata. My former colleagues at Portico supplied this example for me. Just each line is a separate snippet here. The point is that in preservation metadata, they go to the extreme end of change management. Timestamps, recording the name of the system and the version that was used to process the content, workflow names, workflow versions, profile names, profile version numbers, and then they have event metadata and what tools were used and so forth and so on. And I'm not saying that one should do this for everything, but it is a repertory of tools and of approaches to managing change that is potentially useful. So we've, some of this we already do in the XML space. I mean, obviously, the DTD version number is in the DTD, so at that level, that's built into JATS. But if you're using external standards, you might need additional metadata to number those. Content versions, I don't see an easy place to put that in JATS, and in lots of cases, the content is stored in an external content management system, and that metadata lives there, but that metadata is important. And then the next thing is what I'm calling usage profiles, or not standards, but standard practices or standardization. And that is how you are using the standard. And that can be styling, subsets, etc. And there's been a lot of interesting things in that space, and we're going to hear a paper from Mulberry on the conference tomorrow on that. But this has been going on for a long time. So back in the 90s, Elsevier and we at University of Chicago Press, we had validation tools to ensure that our SGML was not only matched the DTD, but also matched our editorial rules and so on. And so that would do things like say, oh, this SGML file is this journal, therefore the section headings for that are A, B, C, F, and G, but not D and E, things like that. Or it's this journal and this issue and volume, therefore the date must be in this format, and so on. So there is a tradition of these kinds of usage styling rules and tools to manage that. The trick, though, is those change over time, so you need to give them version numbers, which we did at Chicago. And and these are very much on the horizon now as pre-edit and post-edit tools. We're going to hear from JATS for reuse and their profile. And where do you put that information? You know, do you embed it as a comment or a processing instruction or an attribute and so on? But so all of these things are ways of tracking change and adding value. So how do you, wrapping up here, how do you do this over time? So you've got to not just version your validations, give them numbers and so on. It's also important to document what is in your practices so that when you have to make a big change, you have the documentation. So at AIP Publishing, when we moved off our proprietary DTD to JATS, we still had all the staff that had helped develop the proprietary DTD, so we had the in-house expertise. But when we migrated 80 years of content, we didn't have 80 years of staff, and we had to mine that content to understand how it was structured and all of that. So documentation adds value long term. So well-controlled diversity, simultaneous and over time, over change, will help support quality of the content and consistency, but it also supports your future needs. So it is worth thinking about that. So the bottom line on diversity of our landscape is there will be change and there is diversity, and because of the richness of the content in the community. And so tracking versions and formats, markup, is important. I'm not saying that everybody needs to do everything that the digital preservation community does, but you should think about that repertory of ways of tracking change and usage and see what is relevant to your business case. There is no magic bullet, and it depends on the specifics of your particular, content, workflow, and business environment. But change and diversity is there, and it isn't going to go away. So that's the bottom line. Any questions or comments, observations? Okay. No? All right, so where'd Jeff go? Yeah, sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you, Evan. Wendell Pease Consulting Services. So I very much like your pointing out that the linkage between diversity in a spatial sense and in a temporal sense. In other words, that when we're talking about long-term maintenance, we're in a sense talking about interchange with the future.
Yes.
Right now, we're not necessarily going to be able to use their data, but they are going to be using our data. The difficulty is that, unlike a partner, we can't really negotiate with them, right? So, in other words, we have to guess what things are going to be important to them and what things are not going to be important to them. Puts us in a disadvantage relative to, a partner saying, "Oh, that's easy. Don't worry about it," when we think it might be difficult. It's sort of. If you take that abstract view of the problem, then I think that it helps to highlight a lot of the difficulties of the overall problem that you're describing, because we are thinking in terms of a negotiation with an absent party. Is that something that I think a lot of things that you suggested sort of fit into that kind of idea, including documentation. But I think one of the most important things is the learning lessons from experience.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering what kind of comments you have on that aspect of the problem, and how can we help to manage our information such that we are able to actually in a sense negotiate fruitfully with people who are not there.
Yeah, it is hard, and the presentations at JATSCon from the archives have been illuminated that point, because they deal with an enormous amount of content essentially handed to them coldly, without a lot of documentation. At Portico, we joked, and this was 10 years ago, we joked that most publishers had at least 3 flavors of XML: their current XML, their early SGML or XML, and their digitized back file. And 10 years later, lots of publishers have changed their hosting platforms, have had to clean up their content, and so they're overall in a somewhat more consistent landscape internally, but that doesn't mean that what they do is the same as what others are doing. So at Portico, in our format registry, this was pre-JATS, we assigned a name to each publisher. Publisher A's version of NLM, Publisher B's version of NLM, Publisher C, because we had to have a separate transform and cleanup suite for each publisher's content to standardize it. But John Meyer is here somewhere. Is it better now, John? No, darn. Yeah, so that's still present, which is what inspired this conversation about diversity. But most of the consistency across the journal publishing industry is being dictated by the hosting platforms in some ways. So, anyway.
Sasha Schwartzman, OSA. As information professionals, we understand very well that all this documentation and everything you talked about is necessary and useful. But putting on your business head, how do you make a case, not as an archive, but as a publisher, that it makes sense or it offers certain benefits from the business perspective to spend time, money, and effort on engaging into documenting everything?
Yeah. Well, the easy way is quality, in the sense that, usage tools that check the quality of your content are also checking the consistency, and that does add value and keeps your customers happy. So that's your foot in the door. on control is the best tools, pre-edit and post-edit, and validating and assuring that your content is quality and consistent. So just document those states as you go, and then you're in a better position if you have to migrate the content in the future. So I would say quality and future migration costs are the business arguments for controlling diversity, managing diversity aggressively. Yeah, that's it. Yep.
Thank you, Evan.
Okay.